Good day, good day. My name is Andrew Sanford. I am the security and team lead at RainFocus. And today we're going to talk about Europe's privacy law, GDPR, for the General Data Protection Regulation. Quick note, this presentation and any opinions in it are my own. This presentation is not endorsed or created by RainFocus. This is my own content, but I just put my title of who I am so you can get a better understanding of who I am. So the objectives of today's training or tutorial are to enable you to meaningfully contribute to GDPR and any privacy-related conversations by providing an overview of this regulation, talking about its impacts and implications, and then briefly reviewing the future of privacy laws, because there are more of them and there are more coming, and so we'll just briefly talk about that. And then we'll talk about how this impacts you, both from the perspective of an individual, as well as somebody who works for an organization. If you're in person, we'll have a Q&A at the end, and feel free to ask questions along the way. But if you're watching this recording, please leave comments in the video, and I will get back to you as soon as I can. I usually respond within 24 hours of seeing a notification. For some reason, notifications on YouTube don't come in for like a few weeks, I've found. Maybe I don't have settings set up right or something, but anyways, I will answer your questions if you have any, so feel free to leave them. The other thing to note is, like with anything that stems from, it's regulation, so there's politics involved. I'm not going to express my personal opinions on the topics that we discussed today, its origins, how it impacts individuals and organizations, and so on. The goal here today is really talk about objectively what this is, why it came to be, what its impact is, and so just know it's totally fine if you want to disagree with something, but for the purposes of this training, we're just going to stick to it being objective. Now, a quick note on GDPR: it is extremely complex. It is very well written. I have read each line of GDPR and various European and US regulations. While it is well written and it's generally clear to understand, it is pretty complex, and this is in part because it's principles based, it's nuanced, and it has exceptions. One key difference between American and European regulations, generally speaking, is that American standards tend to be more prescriptive. They'll tell you that you need to do X, Y, and Z, and you have to follow those to a T. Oh, that rhymed. That's cool. But European standards tend to be more principles-based. This enables organizations to adapt them to their situation and their environment, and that enables them to more effectively achieve the ultimate goals that the regulations set out to be, the goals that the regulations set out to achieve. Now, one drawback of this, though, is that it does create complexity, and you do have to analyze and figure out how it applies to your organization. So if you're planning on implementing GDPR at your company, be sure to consult with both legal counsel as well as appropriate experts on this regulation to help you understand how it applies to your organization and what your organization needs to do. So, in today's overview, we're going to talk about GDPR's origins, its main objectives, some important terms that you need to know in order to understand this regulation, its scope, so where it applies, who it applies to, the rules, and then how it's enforced. So, GDPR started to be drafted in 2012 when European members of Parliament the European Parliament recognized that their current security laws at the time weren't adequately addressing the risks that had evolved, had come up. I believe the last law was drafted in the late 90s. However, people really got behind this law in Europe after Edward Snowden leaked documents in 2013. if you're unfamiliar with Edward Snowden, he in 2013 he was working for the NSA, which is a U.S. government intelligence agency, and he decided that there were a number of things that he didn't like and he viewed as unconstitutional and potentially immoral, and he also didn't think that the government's whistleblower program would adequately address the issues that he saw. And as a result, he decided to exfiltrate. He took a bunch of sensitive documents and gave them to journalists in 2013. And then there were a series of reports over the following years since then that revealed what the NSA was doing, how it's collecting data on individuals. And so before Snowden leaked these documents, it's important to know that Europeans had already been subject to authoritarian government surveillance and had seen the effects of that in their lives. And so privacy concerns are already a really big topic and already really important to Europeans, generally speaking. However, notwithstanding that, tech companies had lobbied and really succeeded in watering down the legislation and making its requirements weaker. Now, after Snowden, Europeans were outraged that primarily American tech companies were sharing their PII, some of it really sensitive, with the US government. And as a result of this outrage, there was a loss of trust in tech companies, and momentum gained and support gained for the drafted legislation, and pretty much tech lobbyists were ignored, and the legislation became much stronger and turned into what it is today. So the legislation, now known as GDPR, was passed in 2016, and it went into effect in early 2018. So now we're going to dive into GDPR and what it is. So the main objectives of GDPR are to formalize privacy as a fundamental human right, give people control over their PII, and designate organizations as stewards rather than owners of PII. Now, a steward is a person or entity who has a responsibility to care, watch over, look after something. In this case, it's personal data. This is a change from in the past, where traditionally companies have viewed all the data they have as their own asset, and they could control it and kind of do whatever they wanted with it. Under GDPR, it changed it so that organizations have to care for and protect the data, and recognize that any PII is not theirs, it's an individual's. And so if an individual comes and says, hey, I want my data to be deleted from your systems, the organization has to delete it from their systems. And then the last thing that it aims to do is make sure that organizations respect individuals' privacy rights. This is primarily done through threat of potentially large fines. And we'll talk about those more later on. So in order to understand GDPR, there are some terms that you have to know and understand. The first is the European Economic Area, or EEA. Second is PII, or Personal Information, Processing, Controller, and then lastly, Processor. So the European Economic Area is comprised of the EU, which on this map is in blue, and then Iceland, Norway, and Liechtenstein, which are in green. Liechtenstein is a tiny country that borders Switzerland, and it's on the east side of Switzerland. To put it in perspective, the EEA has a population of over 515 million people. Its land mass is about half the size of that of the US, and then its economy is roughly the same size as the US's. So GDPR, because it applies to such an influential market, it affects most maybe not most, but a lot of organizations around the world. The next definition is personal information, or PII. Under GDPR, PII is termed as any type of data that can identify an individual, whether directly or indirectly through like a bunch of small pieces of data that can reasonably say that Alice, this person is Alice or this person is Bob. So, for example, it could be a first name and last name, or it could be a group of data like somebody's location and their IP address. It also includes any information that you learn about an individual through analysis. So, for example, Facebook and Google create or enable marketing companies to create systems that can profile individuals. And so, through these analyses, companies can specifically target people who are highly likely to want to buy black shoes, or people who want to buy or some company may launch a product and they want to target people who are likely and highly likely to buy their product. That type of information is also considered PII under GDPR. So if you're an organization that not just collects but also does analysis on individuals, know that the results of that analysis also count as PII and are subject to the same requirements. However, some PII cannot be processed unless there's explicit consent given. Now, GDPR requires consent. That's why you have a lot of cookie notices pop up on a website, so it applies far beyond cookies. But these types of PII require very, very specific consent. And so if you're going to process any types of these PII, make sure that you are talking to your legal counsel and appropriate experts on this. Otherwise, you could find yourself in a heap of trouble from European authorities. So the data that cannot be processed without explicit consent are biometric data, genetic data, health info, political opinions, racial or ethnic origins, individuals' religious or philosophical beliefs, sex life, sexual orientation, as well as trade union membership. The next term we're going to talk about is processing. And processing is any interaction with PII. And so here are some examples. If you adapt data, if you collect PII, if you delete it or erase it, if you publish it, organize it, record it, store it, put access controls around it, you use it. Basically, any interaction with PII, you're processing it. So this is something to be aware of. Now, there are two ways that GDPR classifies organizations. If you are in the financial audit world, I've worked with individuals in these situations. Just throw any preconceived notions you have about these terms out the window because they don't apply to GDPR. The first one is controller, and this is an organization that decides how PII is to be used. And the second is a processor. So this is the organization that actually does the processing of the PII under the direction of the controller. It's important to note that an entity can be both a controller and processor. Generally speaking, if you are a controller, you are almost always a processor, unless maybe you're a consulting firm that says this is what you could do with these types of data. However, if you're a processor, you may or may not be a controller. So there are some organizations that, so if you're a vendor or you help other organizations send out emails or you just do any type of data processing on behalf of another company, you're going to be potentially subject to GDPR. So if you have any questions on these terms, feel free to ask, and in the recording, just leave your questions in the comments. So next, let's talk about the scope of GDPR. So GDPR applies really in two ways. One is an individual focus, and it covers any individuals who is in the EEA. So two things with this. First one is GDPR does not state that the individual has to be a resident, permanent citizen, etc. Given the way that the law is written, if there is a tourist, like let's say an American goes and visits France for a week, the way that the law is written, that American is covered by GDPR for that week. And the second is the EEA. The European Economic, generally speaking, people assume that GDPR applies to the European Union, but it applies to the EEA as a whole. So just be sure that you're including the EU plus Norway, Iceland, and Liechtenstein as you do your GDPR analysis at your company. And then the second way to look at it is organization focused. And any organization that meets at least one of the following has to comply with GDPR. If it has an office in Europe, in the EEA, and or it actively targets EEA citizens, and in this case it is citizens. Basically, if your target market is a country or people in the EEA, you've got to comply with GDPR. So, if you're offering or marketing goods and services to EEA citizens, if you sell goods in euros or any currency used within that area, or let's say your website is in English and you also have Spanish, German, and Italian, it's going to be fairly obvious that you're targeting Europeans as your target market. So the next thing we'll talk about are the rules that organizations need to comply with. They are that they need to help individuals exercise their privacy rights. They need to keep PII secure. And they need to notify individuals as well as EEA authorities of any data breaches that involve PII. And we'll talk about each of these now in depth. When it comes to assisting individuals exercise their privacy rights, number one, organizations need to respond to individuals' requests to exercise their rights, and we'll talk about what those are here in just a second. The second is they need to provide information on what's been done with those requests within 30 days. So if an individual says, hey, I want you to delete my data, you have 30 days to delete that data and inform the individual that you successfully deleted their data from all of your systems. Now, when it comes to rights, individuals have 7 rights. The first is to access their data, to have their data deleted. And a quick note, when it comes to accessing data, individuals are entitled to all of the PII you have on them. And remember, this includes any data that you've created through analysis about them. So deletion, so the data can be deleted. To give consent, so individuals need to be opted out by default. To correction, so somebody's name is spelled wrong, the organization is required to correct that name. To data portability, so this one is basically individuals have the right to have their data transferred from one service to another similar service. So let's say you're storing your photos on one photo platform. You have a right, or that organization has to have a mechanism in place so you can easily transfer that data to another photo storing service. However, you cannot transfer, let's say, your grocery rewards card account info over to your bank account. That's not covered because those aren't the same service. So that's what data portability is. The next one is to object to processing. So if an individual says, hey, I want to demo your product, but I do not want to receive newsletters or sales calls beyond the demo, you have to allow individuals to opt out. And then the last one is to restrict processing. This is pretty similar to objecting to processing, except, so let's say, for example, using it as an individual, you signed up for a newsletter, you've been getting it for 6 months, and then you're tired of getting the newsletters. You can then, under GDPR, you're supposed to have the ability to unsubscribe, to be unsubscribed from that. So those are the 7 rights. If you have any questions about what they are, feel free to contact me, and we can talk about what they are a little more in depth. When it comes to keeping PII secure, organizations need to have a security program in place that appropriately keeps PII secure. It's dependent on the types of data that you process. So if you're processing names and email addresses and that's it, the things you need to do are not going to be as strict as if you're processing government IDs like driver's licenses, social security numbers, and so on. But just know that you do have to have a security program in place. That can include having formal policies and processes, having technical controls in place. There are a number of really great standards out there that can help you form a good security program. And so there's NIST 853, there's ISO 27001, there's SOC 2 Type 2, and so there's a number of things that you can use and research to build out a good program. We just talked about that. The second is organizations need to appoint a data protection officer or a DPO. This needs to be an executive level person or somebody with direct access to executives. This person is responsible for making sure that the organization is complying with GDPR, and they're required to notify EEA authorities if there's a violation of GDPR or a data breach. And lastly, this person cannot be reprimanded for doing their job. So if they find out that the company is not deleting individuals' data and they report that to authorities, they cannot be reprimanded in any way for doing that. And the third thing is organizations need to manage their vendors. Organizations are responsible for their vendors' actions as well as their vendors' actions for those that handle any PII. Additionally, if you're a controller, you have to approve of all of your processors' vendors. So let's say you contract out to a company to send emails. You have to formally approve of their vendors that process PII. There are a number of ways that this can be done. Usually it's done through a contract called like a data protection agreement or a DPA. Now, one quick note before I move on. I'm saying organizations instead of companies because GDPR applies to all organizations. So for-profit companies, non-profits, NGOs, churches, religious groups. If it's an organization, it applies. GDPR applies. Now, quick note: if you're an individual, you don't have to follow GDPR. So, like, if you go to the bar and you get somebody's number, you don't have to sign a contract with them stating that you can have their number and text them, right? So you don't need that. Or if you're writing, or if you have a neighbor that you're writing to your sibling about, you don't have to worry about that. But if you're an organization, any type of organization, just know that you have to follow GDPR. Now, controllers are required to notify individuals and EEA authorities if there's a data breach. When it comes to reporting to authorities, that report has to be given within 72 hours of becoming aware of a breach. This includes if one of your processors have a breach that involves PII that you've had them process. So let's say your processor has a data breach at 5 p.m. on Monday. You're legally required by Thursday at 5 p.m. to notify EEA authorities. And so processors need to notify their controllers promptly. Most contracts I've seen require 24 hours notice. And then the notification to authorities needs to include a description of the breach. So what happened, what types of data were involved, and then what is the controller planning what is the controller going to do to remediate the problem? When it comes to individuals, if a breach is likely to impact the affected individual's rights and freedoms, so Europe has a list of rights and freedoms. Basically, if it's going to cause them harm, if it's going to cause annoyance in their lives, if it's going to cause any level of disruption, for the most part, if you have a data breach involving PII, you have to notify individuals. There are a few exceptions, but they're going to be very, very rare. And then, however, individuals don't need to be notified if the PII was appropriately encrypted. So if somebody steals your encrypted database and you appropriately encrypted it, so you had proper key management in place, you used an appropriate algorithm like AES 256, you don't have to notify them, because it's highly unlikely that the hacker or hackers are going to be able to decrypt that data. Or if you've also taken steps to prevent individuals' rights and freedoms from being impacted. So let's say you didn't restrict access to your employees well enough. One of your employees accessed a customer list, like the sales lead list, and they worked in, let's say like accounting. And then let's say the next day you shut down that employee's access, restricted it, you fixed it. You don't have to report it because they saw the data, but nothing bad's going to come of it. So that's an example. But again, consult with your lawyers on what you need to do. So, now when it comes to enforcement, GDPR is enforced whenever a violation happens. So, a violation is anything that happens when GDPR isn't followed, not just data breaches. So let's say your privacy policy just isn't sufficient. Let's say you don't get consent correctly. And again, this includes getting consent for cookies, like tracking cookies on your website, but it extends far beyond cookies. The other thing about consent is you have to make it easy to give and just as easy to revoke. So if you make people jump through like 3 pages of sites to decline consent, but you only have 1 page to give consent, that's not compliant. And then data breaches are also considered a violation. Now, GDPR gets enforced through 4 ways. The first is self-reported violations that are submitted by the organization's data protection officer. The second is by individuals submitting complaints to authorities, and then the authorities investigate. The third is EEA authorities have the right to audit and investigate organizations whenever they want, but with appropriate notice. And the fourth one is through fines, and that's what we'll focus on here. It's important to note, though, first off with fines, they are administered per violation. So if in 2018 your privacy policy, let's say in like 2020, your privacy policy isn't sufficient and you get fined, that's 1 violation. And then in 2021 you weren't deleting people's data and you had a data breach, those are 2 separate violations. The way the law is written is fines are to be, quote, effective, proportionate, and dissuasive. So really GDPR is aiming to prevent the misuse of personal data. And then also be aware that member states, different countries within Europe, they are allowed to impose additional penalties for non-compliance with GDPR. So, Germany, at the time of this writing, UK, France, Italy, Iceland, they can all, if they want, pass even more stringent penalties for non-compliance. So, fines can really have a material impact or really significant impact on organizations and their bottom lines. So, there are 2 types of violations, minor and major. The maximum fine for a minor violation is either 10 million euros or 2% of global revenue, whichever is greater. And note that this is global revenue. This is not profit. This is not EBITDA. This is not Europe only revenue. This is your global revenue. And then the maximum for major violations is doubled to either 20 million euros or 4% of global revenue. So let's go through some examples really quick. This is a table I've created, and this is the maximum fine that that organizations could face based on their revenue and how severe of a violation they faced. So if you're a startup, and let's say you're bringing in a few $1 million a year in the United States, you could be subject up to a 20 million euro fine. So if you're not taking PII seriously enough, you could very easily go out of business. And for the massive global enterprises, they could have up to $4 billion fines per and remember, this is per violation. So if you have 5 violations in a year, you could face up to 100 million euro or 20 billion euro violation if you're that big. Now, let's talk about GDPR's impact. What's actually been happening? So, when it comes to fines, up until mid-2019, the average fine was $5,600 US. But then, in July, British Airways got fined $230 million, or 1.5% of their global revenue. They had, for those who are technical, they suffered from, they were hacked by MageCart. They had a JavaScript library injected into their website that scraped people's credit cards for about 2 weeks. Basically, British Airways had their website breached, and hackers were able to collect payment information and other information on people. 500,000 people were affected. So this was names, addresses, credit card, travel itineraries, and usernames and passwords. 500,000 people in relative terms of today's data breaches is actually a relatively small number. So it's important to note that even a breach that was as small as that resulted in a massive fine. That same month, July 2019, Marriott Hotels was fined $124 million for a breach that had occurred several months earlier, or was discovered, I should say. It included over nearly 400 million guest records, 24 million passports, and 9 million credit card numbers. The reason this is lower is because this affected not everybody in this breach was within the EEA. In my research, I haven't been able to find actual numbers, but that's why this breach is lower. The thing that's interesting, though, about the Marriott breach is the breach started at least in 2014 and potentially earlier than that. But the breach happened at Starwood Hotels, and Marriott acquired them 2 years earlier in 2016. This is important to note because if your organization plans on acquiring another organization, you will be held liable for their security. And so if they have a data breach, if they're not following GDPR, that's a liability that you're going to have to incur. So as you take your risk management, as you do your risk management, take careful note of this, as well as all the other concerns we've talked about. In response to these announcements, because these were both announced 2 days in a row, EEA officials stated that because personal data has real value just like any other asset, they are not going to hesitate in taking strong action when needed to protect the rights of the public. So going forward, while there will be some small fines for minor violations, this is speaking in likelihood, note that it's highly likely these massive multi-million-dollar fines are going to continue. And so as your organization is processing data, considering what markets to target, be sure to take the risk of GDPR and other things into account. And one thing to note is it's better to invest money into a good, robust security program with appropriate people there than it is to just have nothing in place and just go for it. That's my opinion and my observation. And so just be sure that your company has appropriate security personnel in place. We'll talk about this later, but privacy laws are being enacted all over the world. And the days of just being able to have a startup or a company where security was a third-tier priority for almost any company really doesn't exist anymore. It has to be top of mind and one of the top it needs to be an executive level top priority. So, in my observations, I've found that security standards at organizations are driven largely by the threat of losing money. Now, this isn't necessarily a bad thing. Everybody has limited resources, limited money, and so you have to, as individuals and as organizations, we have to choose what we want, where we want our money to go. And so as the costs of having a security or privacy issue have increased, and the costs of that have increased, organizations are much more willing to invest. Like, let's say an organization faces the threat of a $100 million fine. They're going to invest, say, $10 million in order to have a robust security program in place that can prevent that $100 million fine. So that's just an example. But money can be lost both from the data breaches. So, you have to respond to, you have to remediate that. IBM, I believe it was IBM, did research that showed that the average breach in 2019 cost $3.5 million to remediate and to address. That's just fixing it. That doesn't include any future costs or any other costs like fines from regulations or lost sales, both from current clients or potential clients or customers. Like we said, GDPR's potentially huge fines are driving a lot of change. In the recent years, security standards have just increased across the board, from startups to massive enterprises. Like we talked about, investing money now into a security program to ward off a huge fine is generally what companies are choosing to do. The other reason that security standards are increasing is organizations are required to make sure that their vendors that are processing PII are compliant with GDPR, as well as their vendors' vendors. So you're seeing not just third-party, but fourth-party risk being required by GDPR. And so companies that are further down the supply chain are, I guess this isn't supply chain, but just there's a rippling effect where organizations, even if they're not based in Europe or normally wouldn't care about GDPR, if one of their clients or customers does, they then have to care about it. And so you're just seeing a lot of change. There have been some unintended consequences, though, that weren't foreseen with GDPR, primarily through identity theft and as well as stalkers. So what some organizations are seeing are imposters who request info under others' identities. So if your organization receives a request from an individual to have they want all of their data downloaded, some stalkers are doing that to get, say, private photos or to get financial information of individuals. This includes both stalkers, bounty hunters. So bounty hunters are known to get location data. Identity thieves are a big one. So what organizations really need to do is they need to better validate a person's identity. Otherwise, giving information about Alice to Bob in an unauthorized manner is going to count as a data breach. So just make sure that you're validating people's identities. And in my opinion, there probably also needs to be a centralized mechanism to verify identities, potentially. So anyways, this is complex, but just make sure that you're taking steps to reasonably ensure that you know that the person who's making the request is that person. And then lastly, where are these laws heading? Many countries already have laws in place. So we're also going to include standards. So PCI is technically a standard. But there's GDPR, there's the United States, there's HIPAA, and California's Privacy Act. Russia has their own that's pretty stringent. Each of these countries have their own, and many more already have some in place, and more are coming. It seems like at least once or twice a month there's some sort of new regulation that gets passed, and so it's coming. And going forward, information security and privacy, they're only going to become more complex than they already are. So for example, the majority of US states have their own individual security and privacy laws that have their own requirements. The good news is that those requirements tend to overlap a lot, but you still have to follow them. And then more countries are going to have laws in place. And it's important to note that some of these laws are going to be influenced by geopolitics. This is just a fact of the matter. We're starting to see the internet start to become segmented. Some people use the term balkanization or balkanized. And so just know as world events happen, laws and regulations are going to change. And then along with all this, the need for InfoSec professionals is really increasing. Organizations, because the risks have increased so much, in order to mitigate those increased risks, organizations need to do more to address those risks, and that includes hiring security professionals. And so if you're interested in this field, it's a great field, I love it. But along with this, so if you want to, it's a great field. You can have a good income. If you're an organization, also recognize that the pay for security professionals is increasing. So, for example, a chief information security officer in California was making $600,000 in 2016, and after GDPR came into effect, their salary quadrupled at the same company. So it's, as things become more complex, it's requiring more experience, more understanding, and there's also a shortage of security professionals. Another thing is, as an organization, be willing to train people. In the industry, I've seen that most jobs require 3 to 5 years of experience, but it's impossible to get those 3 to 5 years of experience without job experience, but they're not going to hire you because you don't have job experience. So it's kind of this bad cycle. And so as an organization, really consider being willing to take on somebody who has a passion for this and has shown that, and be willing to train them, even if they aren't necessarily very skilled. They can become skilled, and it's a community with a lot of resources, a lot of people, who are willing to help. So yeah, and then how does this impact you? So, like we've basically said, regulations are going to affect all types of businesses. Some startups have to worry about GDPR, some don't, but there are going to be more laws that are also going to require more stringent security standards. And so if you're starting a business or you're going to launch a new product, be sure to consult with legal counsel as well as your company's security/privacy teams, just to make sure that you're addressing those risks, you're aware of them, and you're able to make informed decisions. Because the last thing any of us want to do is make a decision and turns out that there was something we didn't know existed, some term and condition or some risk, and then we end up in a worse spot than we were before. So this is just something to keep in mind. We've talked about this, so if you're in the training, or you're watching this, really consider a career in InfoSec. We need we need people who are ethical and have integrity. And if you are interested, it is possible to get into this field. It does require some work at the moment, but get an internship or work experience, take that low-level position Or if you're more experienced, like you've been a programmer for a long time, or you've been an auditor for a long time, it's a lot easier to make that jump. Also, get certifications. This industry cares a lot about certifications, even more so than college degrees, generally speaking. Like Security Plus is a great one to get. Do personal projects, network with people, and then here in Utah, there's a hackerspace here. All right, so in review, today we talked about the basics of GDPR, and the goal of this is to enable you to meaningfully contribute to GDPR-related discussions. So we talked about where GDPR came from, where it applies, its rules, and how it's enforced, as well as its impact. And we also briefly talked about the future of privacy regulations. And then we talked about how all this impacts you, primarily from the viewpoint of an organization, but there are also some takeaways from this as an individual. So thanks for taking the time to watch this. If you have any questions, please reach out to me. These are links that you can use to get a hold of me, or leave a comment in the description below, and I'll be more than happy to chat with you. So thanks for taking the time to watch this, and don't forget to leave a like and subscribe. So have a great day. Bye.